we are going to talk about sex, baby. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Then we had to sign it. And in signing that contract, we also had to agree to go to marriage counseling. We were 16 years old in high school. If self-control is your only strategy against sexual temptation, that is either going to fail you or you're going to shut down your sexuality entirely, which we don't want you to do either.
Just because you've had sex, just because you have done things that you regret, just because things out of your control have happened to you, it does not mean that that amazing gift of sex is off the table or is ruined for life.
Unlike some times when you go to church and your pastor has a conversation, they're like, we're going to talk about sex, all singles leave the room. We're not doing that today. Okay. Of course, we're not going to be talking explicit things, but we're going to be really teaching from a place of the things that we did before we got married. And P.S., we've only been married a year. So, we're not necessarily experts in the sex department per se, but we did really prepare to have a healthy sexual ethic and a healthy sexual relationship in our marriage. And we want to share some of those things with you today. Just really quick before we dive into that, we're going to tell you guys a little bit about who we are, and then we're going to get into it. So I'm Kait.
And I'm JJ.
And we run The Heart of Dating, which is started as a podcast about 6 years ago, and it's still going. Every Wednesday and Friday, we have new episodes. We've covered probably almost any question that you have in dating. We've probably covered it over the last 6 years. And from the podcast, which is expanded, we have been able to grow our ministry to be more. We now do events around the world. We actually did an event in Norway this summer. We host a yearly conference. This year, it's going to be in Nashville, December 29th and 30th. A few years ago, I had the honor to write a book about rejection, which I wrote in my singleness and had a lot to do with my story of rejection and healing rejection. And we run some awesome dating programs, specifically one called the School of Dating, which is a 8-week mentorship program. So we just love serving singles. And though we are married, we have been single way longer than we have been married. I was single for 18 years before I got married just this last year. And JJ was single for not quite as long as time because he is younger than me. But he's also been single for quite many years. So we're not those people that are like, oh my gosh, we've been married since we were 22 and we're going to preach to you about singleness and sex. No, like literally we have been way more ghosted and online dating and doing all those things than we have ever been in a marriage and having sex. Okay. So let me just put that out there. So we're going to give you 3 different ways to prepare for a healthy sexual experience in marriage, and also how to steward your sexuality now in your singleness. The first thing that we want to talk about is really just healing from any sexual past that you might have, whether you have an extensive sexual past, which is part of my history, or whether you don't necessarily have an extensive physical sexual past, but you have some distorted views of sex and sexuality based on your upbringing. So, like I said, I have a past, okay? And I also have a really bad experience from my past with purity culture teaching. I did grow up in the 90s, and I did experience, in high school, I got a boyfriend, and my pastors, the leaders of my youth group found out, and they were like, oh my goodness, you're not allowed to date unless you're dating for marriage. Like, why are you guys dating? Like, you can't be doing this. And we were like, we didn't know that. Okay, great. So basically, this leader of this group pulled us into his office and gave us a list of rules that we had to follow. 2 pillows between you at all time. Your faces have to be at least a foot apart at all times. You can only hang out in groups, never use blankets, this, that, and the other. Okay, I'm telling you, this is real. Then we had to sign it. And in signing that contract, we also had to agree to go to marriage counseling. We were 16 years old in high school. Okay, so I just want to let y'all know I grew up in that purity culture. So if you did as well, I want to see that in the chat. I can relate to you. And while purity culture did a lot of things, unfortunately, wrong, I don't believe it had necessarily bad intentions. It hurt a lot of people, but I don't believe the intentions were to hurt people. Okay, another part of my past is though I grew up with all those purity culture teachings, I had so many issues in my life and the way I saw myself, specifically relationship with men in my life and my father, that I ended up turning to sex as a means to fill my value and my worth. And I used sexual things to connect with men to fill a void inside of me of wanting to be loved. And eventually, this led me to being sexually abused in my life. So there were a lot of sexual, there's a lot of sexual healing that I needed to do in my life, a lot of sexual shame that I had throughout my life. And when I finally faced it in my mid 20s, I really had to unroot all the things I had learned about sex, the connections I had made between sex and intimacy, and relearn what healthy intimacy was. And within all that, I also had to learn, what does God say about sex really? And I had to connect to my why, not the why that I got from my youth group, but what do I really believe about sex in tandem with God? And what does God's word say? And how do I not should on myself? Kate, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, but instead rebuild my why that is connected to the heart of God. And that is such an important part of this process of healing from your sexual past, is redeveloping a healthy sexual ethic. Okay. And then from there, I was able to set boundaries. And my boundaries, because of my sexual past, were very strict. Maybe they were way stricter than some of my friends, because I had to personally set up more strict safeguards, because I knew myself. I knew my past. I knew my history. And so, yeah, I wasn't making out with guys. I was trying not to make out with guys. I was not trying to have guys over at 11 o'clock at night, even though I was 30 years old. And, oh, I'm old enough now, I should know better. No, I knew my history and I had to set stricter boundaries. So that's a bit of my story.
I love it. And I hope some of you guys really relate with that story. My story is a little different, which I love because it kind of allows Kate to connect with a group of people, and then I connect with a totally separate group of people, because my sexual past was, it was somewhat external, but it was extremely internal, in the sense of, like, externally with like other girls and sexual partners and dating, I had actually a very small physical history. I was very transparent with Kate when we were dating that I had made out with multiple women, but really that was kind of the extent, except for I had done oral sex once. So as far as like an external record and record keeping, it wasn't very extensive. Now internally and between myself and my challenges, I actually had a huge problem with porn and masturbation from about 14 to 24 years old. So what's funny, especially in purity culture and the churches, there's so much emphasis put on your external history and your sexual partners, when in reality, I had so much sin and challenges and shame, and mine was more just internal, with me and sexual objects and pornography. So even though, and I say this all the time, even though I was a virgin from like a penetrative, sexual standpoint, I absolutely had soul ties and connections with women all across, the internet and, in my past. So, even though you can check this box, and I don't know if I love being transparent about this, because I used to quietly check this box about, are they a virgin or not? And that was kind of like my barometer, my thermometer about my dating partner's like spiritual maturity. Like, hey, if they're a virgin, okay, check that box. They must love God. They must be smart. They must be wise. Maybe I could date her and maybe I can't. If she's not a virgin, whoa, 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 proceed with tons of caution. Like, let me really make sure that this girl is who she says he is. Like, she's kind of damaged goods. And as I kept dating and then pursuing God and growing my relationship, I was just so fundamentally wrecked in my heart and soul when I really learned that the Bible is filled with imperfect person after imperfect person after imperfect person, with full of imperfect past. I mean, we talk about the apostle of our faith, Paul, who was the greatest writer of the Bible, the greatest apostle of all, one of the most influential people in the kingdom of God to ever exist. And what was his past like? He was hunting down Christians, literally hunting down Christians. So if God can look at Paul and say, I don't care, I'm using you, and it's about who you are today, well, why can't I look at someone who could be my future wife and say, why is that not possible for me? And more importantly, it's not about her past, it's about who she is today, right? And more importantly, if I actually think about this, how could I not extend grace to her after everything I have received and the mercy and forgiveness of my sexual past that was way more hidden, way more extensive than anyone would ever see? How could I not extend that same grace that I have been extended for my past? Right. And more importantly, why is my sexual past less bad than hers just because it's maybe more internal? So there's all these questions that we have to ask ourselves when it comes to purity culture. You know, the biggest mistake of purity culture was it elevated your sexual purity above everything. And the reality is that nothing is elevated before God except the fact that you're covered by the blood of Jesus. No behavior, no obedience, no self-righteousness could ever be elevated. And so that's the biggest mistake of purity culture is, hey, your sexual purity can elevate you to a more righteous and pure point before God. And that can be further from the truth. The reality is that whether you've had extensive sexual trauma and abuse, or you've had pornography and masturbation challenges for years and years, I don't care how vivid, how hard, how deep. The reality is that this is amazing. Eternally, where it really matters, we will be fully redeemed. But there is a reality that on earth, we get a sample, a taste, a little tease of redemption on earth and our physical bodies on earth. So I've seen a lot of comments on sexual trauma, abuse, and the reality is that absolutely there is totally in God's grace and favor and blessing, there is redemption available for you at this moment on this life and this earth. Totally. So just because you've had sex, just because you have done things that you regret, just because things out of your control have happened to you, it does not mean that that amazing gift of sex is off the table or is ruined for life.
That's where we wanted to start, and we could go there for like the next hour with y'all, but we're going to transition into the second biggest thing in preparing for sex for a single, which is really deep-rooting some sex myths that we believe about sex that we've maybe believed because of culture, maybe we've believed because of our community or what our parents have told us, or even what we've experienced in our church community. Okay, so we want to highlight just a few of the biggest sex myths out there and replace them with a theology of sex as much as we can. We'll probably get to more of that in the Q&A, and then lastly, we're going to go over how to steward your sexuality well in singleness. So here are some of the biggest sex myths out there that we just want to like really briefly debunk.
Yeah. So number one, and there's a lot of these, right? We gather these from our house. We gather these from our church. We gather these from Disney, from porn, from wherever, okay, throughout our whole entire life. One of the biggest myths that we see is that if you wait to have sex, then guess what? Sex is going to be amazing. You better wait. You better reserve your purity. You better withhold sex, because if you don't, you're going to have an awful sex life. But if you hold it, if you're pure, if you're a virgin, you're going to have awesome, amazing, healthy sex. And this assumption is basically saying God's going to bless you if you wait and if you obey. And the reality is that that's completely untrue. God doesn't work in unspoken deals. He doesn't say, okay, if you do X, if you obey me, then I'm going to bless you with Y, right? And specifically with sex, this is so dangerous because the reality is that sex, especially in the beginning, should be relatively awkward. It can actually be painful. It can actually be maybe even uncomfortable. It can be frustrating. It can be, it can have tears. It can have shame. popping up, and it has nothing to do with maybe your sexual past or how pure you were or how impure you were, right? The reality is that sex is a journey, and especially in the beginning, it's going to be the most awkward, strange, foreign because you're just starting. And
Mhm.
that is a great thing. So, this is a myth to say that sex is going to be amazing if you obey, if you remain pure, if you remain righteous, it's going to be amazing. It can be amazing for anyone and everyone who's been redeemed, but more importantly, it's a journey. So there's no guarantee from the very beginning it's going to be this hot, wild, amazing James Bond sex that you see in the movies, okay? It's actually going to be the opposite, and that's a good thing.
Yes. And I think with that, it's coming back to your why should not be rooted in I'm doing this so that I can have an amazing sex life. The reality of why you should be waiting to have sex in marriage is to honor God. My goal is to honor God. My goal isn't to get something out of this. My goal is to just simply honor God because this is what God's will is for me. He wants me to wait. He has said that like sex is best in a covenant. And so your why has to be rooted to I'm doing this just to honor God, not to get something out of it.
Right.
The second myth is that women don't like to have sex and it's only to serve men. Now, I just want to say that we did an entire podcast series earlier this year, season X, season 10 on our podcast, where we talked all about sex for about 13 different episodes. And we dove into a lot of things. And I just say, as a woman, the reality of the myth that women don't like sex is it's a real thing. There are a lot of narratives out there that say sex is really to please the man and that women, you're not really going to like it, but you need to do it because it's your duty. That is not true. God designed orgasmic features in both the male and the female, and he designed it to be pleasurable for both the male and the female. And anatomically, that is how he designed it. Women, if you are programmed to think that you are not going to like sex, that is something that I would love for you to start healing before you ever enter into a marriage. Because if you have the mindset, women don't like sex, I'm not going to like it, then you're probably not going to like it, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm sorry if that's been spoken over to you, or if I'm sorry if you've heard that from married women. Any married women that are saying women don't like sex or I don't like sex, they are not in a healthy sexual relationship. Okay. They do not have a healthy relationship to sex. And that is not something you should even be listening to. As a married woman, just a year in, okay, I can honestly tell you, women, you can like sex, you can love sex, and that is an absolute myth. But I want JJ to answer number 3, the third myth we want to cover, which is that sometimes men feel like women should be on call for sex.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of household you guys grew up in. I don't know what kind of church you grew up in. I will say, from a traditional evangelical Christian household that I grew up in, the Bible Belt of the United States, which is the South, there was definitely this unwritten expectation and rule that, hey, men have a much higher sex drive. They have a huge sexual need. And the reality is that women, hey, you got to put out whenever he says, I need this, right? It might be to help him cope with masturbation. It might be to help him cope with his sexual urges and his needs. And hey, he's the man of this house. Like, if he wants sex, then guess what? He's going to get sex. The reality is that this couldn't be further from biblical, true biblical sex, with it, which is incredibly mutual. Both parties are saying, yes, this is something that I want to have, versus a silent no. And what we see time and time after again, and story after story, is there was a partner in the relationship, in the marriage, who silently had a strong no, but did not feel like they could express that no, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is part of my duty as a wife. Now, the reality is that that is very, very tough. Some people really hold on to this idea that, hey, you should not withhold sex. And that's for negotiation. Sex or not withhold for arguing and negotiations. It's not supposed to be something you use as a tool to get your partner to do something. That's manipulation. And it's saying, don't use sex as a manipulative tool. But the reality is that 1 Corinthians 7 is, hey, you don't own your body. And this is both ways, in the sense of a woman has a right to say no, and the man has a right to say no. And what people don't realize is the early church, do you guys understand? It was made up mostly of women because it was the first time in human history where women were respected as human beings and not property. Okay. This was revolutionary at the time. Paul is basically, for the first time in human history, saying, hey, women actually have a voice. Women are to be respected. And not only are they to be respected, but guess what, husbands? You have to lay down your life and respect them and love them as Christ did for the church.
Yes.
Okay. So this was totally crazy for its time and somewhat normal for us now. But this is the reality of sex, is that it is incredibly mutual. And my question for men and women is this: why would you guys not want your sex life to be incredibly mutual? As a man, as a woman, don't you want a partner who wants to say yes to sex? And if they have a no, why would you ever want to have sex in that sense?
Yep.
Right?
100%. There's also going to be seasons if you are pregnant and you give birth that like you can't have sex physically after that. And you like, there's just so many elements to this. Gosh, we can go on and on, but I'm sure we'll have questions about that. The fourth myth is that sex is easy and frequent. And, this is something that is really driven by Hollywood. You see these Hollywood films, which I laugh at seeing this now, especially, but you see like films in Hollywood all the time. And I'm sure you guys have seen them throughout the years where it's like all of a sudden they are in throes with the passion of one another and the chemistry comes over them. And it's just like, we're going to have sex right here, right now, wherever it is. And then they're laying in bed together after, and they're just like, they fall immediately asleep and everything is so peaceful and wonderful. And that view is not accurate. Okay. That is not how it happens. And that is a bad narrative that we see over and over in Hollywood about how sex is portrayed. It's this idea that sex is like ultra fiery. It's going to be easy. It's going to be frequent. It's going to be just like this perfect picturesque thing. And then you lay in each other's arms in bed afterwards. And that's not necessarily how it is. Sex takes a lot of work to figure out what you like, what your partner likes, when you feel most sexually aroused, when your partner feels most sexually aroused, what time of day is a good time of day for you guys. Like there are so many different things that go into having a healthy sex life, and it depends on each partner. It's like an equation. You have to figure out one another and figure out what's best for one another. So sex can be amazing. It can absolutely be amazing in the context of marriage, but is sex easy and always so frequent and having it 3 times a day is the goal? No, that is not necessarily the goal. The goal is to be emotionally, spiritually, and yes, physically connected. So we want to cover one more thing, which is stewarding your sexuality well in singleness.
Exactly. And we love this. And this is actually where it gets the most practical and helpful for singles. Number one, just know you don't control the thoughts that come into your mind. If you view it like this, I have an airport, there's planes all swirling around and around. You don't have control over the airplanes that are flying overhead. A lot of people like to use the image of a nest and birds. There's a lot of birds flying, and you don't control the birds, okay? The birds are always flying, but you do give permission for what bird can land in your nest. You do give permission for what airplane can be landing in your airport. Okay. So you can control what to do with your thought life. You can't necessarily control what thoughts come into your mind. Okay. And when you feel that urge because of your hormones or urges, you need to feel the discomfort. Okay. One key thing that is, we love to say it's a longing, it's an urge, it's a desire. However, it's not a need. Okay. It's not a need. And there is a big difference between the two. Needs don't pass over. Okay. If you're hungry and thirsty, you're only going to get more hungry and thirsty. Okay. But I'm so sorry, but if you're horny, right? If you are feeling that urge, that longing, it does pass.
Mm-hmm. So this is a really important thing because like seeing somebody and thinking, oh, they're beautiful, or, oh my gosh, they're kind of sexy isn't necessarily the bad thought. It's what you do after that point. Am I going to linger? Am I going to go down the rabbit hole? Am I going to think about this more? Is this going to drive me to look at pornography later? Like, but seeing a person and having the thought they're beautiful, they're sexy, or whatever the thought is not necessarily the thing that we need to put shame over. We don't need to put shame over any of this. If you have the thought, that's a natural thought. It's what you do with the thought after that. Do you linger in it? Do you run with it? Or do you redirect it? Okay. And here's the thing, we can feed the urge by thinking about it more. We have to be aware of what we're watching, what we're reading, what we're taking in, because those things all will feed those urges, right? So if you're constantly watching things that are showing you sexual things or reading things that are showing you sexual things, you are feeding that urge. So when a thought does come into your mind, it's going to be much harder to pivot out of that thought. You're going to start thinking of those images that you saw in that movie or from pornography if you're looking at pornography. So, when you feel this need to, I have to have sex or I have to masturbate or I have to do something, it's not actually that you need sex. What you're actually looking for is intimacy. What you're actually looking for is intimacy. You're looking for something that's not just sexual. You're looking at the end of the day for intimacy. And oftentimes when you really are craving that thing, it can be because maybe you're lonely or you need some emotional connection.
Exactly. I mean, listen, if anyone here struggle with pornography, and this includes me for 10 years battling day in and day out, the reality is that why would I go to pornography, a sexual desire, a lusting longing, when I was bored, when I was frustrated, when I felt rejected, when I was trying to cope with emotional pain? Why would I go to a sexual act and fulfillment for an emotional pain and desire that I needed to satisfy? Right? It would be like saying, I'm emotionally devastated. I'm sad. I'm going to go to physical food to fulfill this desire, this frustration, this boredom, this sadness. Why would I go to ice cream? That's a physical solution, a physical feeding for an emotional desire. But do you see how they're linked? It's the same thing for sex. We go to sexual intimacy, pornography, for the fulfillment of an emotional need or desire.
So a big part of this too, if self-control is your only strategy against sexual temptation, that is either going to fail you or you're going to shut down your sexuality entirely, which we don't want you to do either. We're not asking you and we're not encouraging you to entirely shut down your sexuality, because your sexuality is a beautiful thing created by God. What we're saying is, how do you steward this well? How do you pivot it into things that are appropriate for the stage of life that you're in singleness? So we want to encourage you, when you have those moments of questioning, oh my gosh, or a thought comes into my mind, ask the Lord to begin showing you where you might need healing. Ask the Lord where you have needs maybe in your life that aren't being met, emotional needs, intimacy needs. Maybe you truly just are lonely and you need more intimate time with people in your life, and yet you're using sex or masturbation or pornography as a way to scratch that itch instead. And so we can invite the Lord into these desires. He's not ashamed or looking at you with shame because you have a sexual desire. He's just asking you to bring it to him and steward it in a healthy way.